Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and it is an honour for me to rise today to represent the constituents of Regina Qu'Appelle in opposition to the bill that will add more inflationary fuel to the fire. And I caught the last few minutes of my honourable colleague's speech, the Liberal member for Winnipeg North, and I am just astounded at how much he can get wrong in just a short 20-minute period of time. But I give him full marks for efficiency. He crammed a lot of errors and a lot of misinformation into one 20-minute speech. I probably don't have enough time to address all of them in my speech because of just the sheer volume of inaccuracies that he put into his, pun not intended there. So I thought I'd start maybe by helping the honourable member understand what caused inflation, because that's what this bill is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be to help address the suffering that families who are experiencing the sticker shock every time they go into a grocery store or a hardware store or any other store that they might have to buy goods or obtain services from. And prices that they've been used to over the past few years are now much, much higher. And we know the Prime Minister doesn't think about monetary policy. I'm not sure if anybody else in the caucus that he leads does, but I'll help the member understand what causes inflation. The inflation that Canadians are suffering from is directly linked to the massive Liberal deficits that this government chose to run, starting before the pandemic even started. Why do I say that? Well, because that's what the Bank of Canada admitted. The Bank of Canada, which is in charge of Canada's money supply, has acknowledged that it was the money creation that it embarked upon at the beginning of 2020, in March of 2020, just as this government was racking up record high deficits, the biggest deficits Canadians have ever seen, on their way to adding more to the national debt than every single other Prime Minister combined. This government added $500 billion to the national debt. Now, when the government spends more than it takes in, it has to borrow that. It has to find someone who has money to lend it to them. Now, that's normally carried out during normal economic times by the bond market. Large investors go out and they buy government treasury bonds. They're basically IOUs that the government writes, borrowing money from someone who has it, taking it and spending it with the promise to pay it back. And it's that promise to pay it back with interest that is costing the Bank of Canada money now. In fact, as a little aside, the Bank of Canada is now actually losing money for the first time in Canadian history. This has never happened before, but I'll get back to that in a moment. So what the government did is it turned to the Bank of Canada and it started floating these IOUs, these government bonds. And the Bank of Canada said, we'll buy them. We'll buy the government bonds that the government is now issuing with these massive deficits. The problem is, Bank of Canada didn't actually have anybody else's money. The Bank of Canada didn't have lots and lots of deposits from Canadians or lots of deposits on account from financial institutions that it could then use. Sorry, when I say it didn't have deposits, it didn't have any of its own money on deposit. It didn't have some vault of cash that they could turn around and buy those government bonds with. So what did it do? It had to create the money. It created that money right out of thin air. It exchanged the bonds that other institutions had bought, so large profitable banks, like the big five banks in Canada, and other types of large and financial institutions that have accounts with Canada's central bank. They bought the bonds from the federal government, turned around and sold them to the Bank of Canada in exchange for brand new money that had never existed before. Literally with little ones and zeros and keyboard strokes, the Bank of Canada just dumped cash into those big banks and large financial institutions and then took those bonds in exchange. So that's how the Canadian economy was flooded with over $400 billion of brand new money. And we have seen the effects of that. The Liberal government's trickle-down economics, where they pumped hundreds of billions of dollars into the most wealthiest and most profitable corporations in Canada, the big banks. They pushed that money through that system. Well, the big winners when it comes to this type of arrangement, Madam Speaker, is whoever gets the money first. Because there's a little bit of a lag between rising prices and money creation. Because the market has not yet learned that there's a whole bunch of new money chasing the same amounts of goods. So the prices in the grocery store haven't, at this point, yet started to go up. And the prices for commodities haven't, at this point, yet started to go up. So those large financial institutions, those massively profitable banks, they got to buy up all these assets, and they got to push that money through everything from commodities to real estate to anything else you can imagine. While the prices were still low, they got the new money first, bought it all as much as they could, and that's when the prices started to rise. Now, by the time that new money hits Canadians' pockets, it's already too late. The prices at the grocery store have already skyrocketed. We've seen food inflation go over 8% for a couple of months now. The average inflation index, the CPI, it's been hovering around 7% for several months now. So just as the time that Canadians start to get the new money that the government's created, the prices have already gone up. And that's when those big banks and financial institutions, that's when they can sell. And they make those massive profits on what they can buy low with newly created money and sell high after the inflationary effects take into account. And that's why we saw record profits during and after the pandemic. Record profits by Canada's largest banks. This is the result of the Prime Minister's economic policy, allowing the richest and most profitable corporations in Canada to make even more money, while Canadians subsidize that profit through higher prices in the grocery store aisles. That's why these inflationary deficits are so devastating, Madam Speaker, and that's why Conservatives are opposed to new measures that force the government to borrow more money to pay for new spending. It's a little bit like a superficial treatment to a problem. We can all think of examples of what might look to be something or a course of action that might help with a problem that actually makes the problem worse. You might have experienced in your life, Madam Speaker, you might have seen public service videos about fire safety, where they say, don't ever pour water on a grease fire. You can imagine a young child, perhaps, or someone who's never been educated along the lines of fire safety, seeing a fire. And we're all taught from a very young age, water beats fire, put out fires with water, always keep a bucket of water if you're having a campfire, things like that. We all understand that. We see pictures of firefighters putting out fires with big hoses of water. So you can imagine someone about to dump water on a grease fire thinking that they're helping. But we all know what will actually happen. We have to resist the temptation to apply a superficial antidote to a problem. We all know on this side of the house that instead of pouring water on a fire, you have to treat it in other ways. You have to put a lid on that fire to remove it from the heating element. There are other ways to tackle that fire rather than making it worse. A thirsty person might look at an ocean shore and think, boy, I'm so thirsty, I'm going to go down and I'm going to take a nice long drink of water. As Homer Simpson taught us, Madam Speaker, water everywhere, so let's go have a drink. It's not actually how the poem goes. Of course, it's water everywhere and not a drop to drink, because ocean water makes thirst worse. That's what we're seeing with this Liberal government bill. The member from Winnipeg North gave a great speech trying to convince Canadians that this would help, that while prices are going up in many aspects of their lives, here's the government coming along with a way to try and reduce some costs for them. But where are they going to get the money for that? They're going to have to borrow more money to pay for that. So any benefit that any Canadian might hope to receive under this government's plan that we're debating today will evaporate because of the effects of this new government plan. In other words, the government is trying to convince us that a government program will help alleviate the problems caused by government programs. And that's where Conservatives come along, because you see, we take a more comprehensive look at issues. The Liberals and their allies in the costly coalition, the NDP, who are pushing all this new spending, working hand in hand with the government to drive up the costs of living with higher spending and more borrowing to pay for it. That's where this is coming from. that costly coalitions approach is always very superficial. You can kind of make the comparison to candy before supper. You know, there's a problem, here's a simplistic solution, we're just going to have a new government program to dole out more money. Conservatives understand that you have to treat the fundamental issues that caused it first, and we would be doing Canadians a far greater service, including low-income Canadians who are being hit hardest by inflation. We would be doing those individuals a much greater service if we came to this place every day trying to reduce the cost of government, looking for ways to reduce spending, cutting out inefficiencies, like, for example, Madam Speaker, the $500 million that this government tried to give to their friends at the WE organization, the $54 million for the Arrive scam app that didn't work, wasn't needed, and could have been designed and programmed in a weekend for a fraction of the $54 million that taxpayers had to pay for. The Prime Minister might have looked at ways to visit London where he didn't have to charge $6,000 a night for a single room, Madam Speaker. Those would be the types of things, if we all came together, if every member of Parliament went back to their offices tonight, scrolled through the public accounts, which were just tabled this morning, and we all put our collective heads together to look for ways that we could eliminate wasteful spending and bring down that cost of government so the government could pay back those IOUs, retire those bonds, take that brand new created money that's flowing out of the system out of the system to return back to normals where that money was backed up by real economic activity and not just ones and zeros on the computer terminals at the Bank of Canada. If we did that, Madam Speaker, we'd put a lot more purchasing power back in the hands of Canadians who have worked so hard to earn it. That's why they call inflation the hidden tax, the most insidious tax of all. Because when the government raises a tax rate, they have to do it in this House for all to see. They have to bring forward a motion or a bill to raise those taxes. Opposition parties hold them to account, and every Canadian has an elected representative that can vote yes or no based on that proposal. But when the Bank of Canada, or when the government causes inflation through the Bank of Canada by forcing the bank to purchase those government bonds, there's no vote in the House. There's no debate. There's no accountability. Not any one of us got to read the proposal, make a decision, and vote based on our constituents. And our constituents can't hold us to account because none of that ever took place. It just happens. It happens because of those powerful, unaccountable officials just made a decision one day. And that's why Conservatives are opposed to this legislation, knowing that it will make the problem worse. There are other ways the government could handle or tackle the cost of living crisis. This opposition has proposed a very concrete proposal that we should be debating today instead of a bill that's going to add more borrowing costs on the government and therefore lead to even worse inflation. We're about to head into the winter months, Madam Speaker, and many Canadians are already getting a taste of what those home heating costs are going to look like over the next few months. And I want to take a few moments right now to inform you, Madam Speaker, that the higher costs that Canadians are about to get hit with, and some have already started to experience, these are not some accidental outcomes from government policies. These are not unintended consequences. It's not like the government was trying to do something and accidentally caused home energy costs to rise. This is a feature of the NDP and Liberal coalition's plan to make home heating costs more expensive. They want Canadians to pay more for filling up their tank or for heating their homes. You don't have to take my word for it.
It's deliberate.
They've admitted it. They have built a fake environmental policy around the idea of making Canadians pay more for fueling their cars, for purchasing goods that have to be transported to Canada, or for the crime of heating their homes in the winter. That's what they want. They want Canadians to feel pain when it comes to those types of goods. They admit it. It's in the rationale for their carbon tax. Well, here's the thing, Madam Speaker. The carbon tax isn't working. Canadians are getting all the pain and none of the environmental gain. This government hasn't hit a single target it has set for itself. The people who are concerned about climate change the most should be opposed to the carbon tax the most.
Totally.
Because the government's gone all in on a failed policy that for 7 years now has been proven not to work. So that's why this party, that's why the official opposition and Conservative members of Parliament have been working so hard since this fall sitting began to convince the government to do no further harm when it comes to borrowing and spending, driving up inflation, and to control some of the things it can control and cancel the planned tax hikes. This government's plan is to triple the carbon tax. And the member for Winnipeg North might like to make jokes about Tim Hortons double-double. But there's a reason why we're highlighting it, Madam Speaker, and why we want Canadians to understand, because it's already hard enough to make ends meet for the vast majority of Canadians. We're hearing really shocking stats. Canada's a G7 developed country, and 1.5 million people visited the food bank last month. That's unbelievable. Record highs. It's gone up 15%. 15% more visits to the food bank last month than the month before. Canadians who are working, who have 2 jobs in some cases, and double income households, because they have to pay more and more for their mortgage as interest rates go up and higher costs at the grocery store, now have to turn to charity at food banks just to be able to feed their children. And you know what else is very alarming, Madam Speaker? Those food banks, they're running out too, because Canadians have fewer and fewer goods to donate to the food bank. And that's the thing about Liberal and NDP coalition economic policies. It leads to scarcity. When Conservatives are in government, we lower the costs of government. We leave more money in the economy, more money in the pockets of hard-working Canadians. And that does more good for low-income Canadians because there are more jobs to fill. There's more opportunity. And when Canadians have more at the end of the month, they can make decisions to be charitable. They can fill up those shelves at the food bank so that the less fortunate have more choice and more options and have more support when they need it. NDP and Liberal policies that drive up the cost of fuel and home heating and other essentials and chase away jobs and investment means that there's less at the end of the month for Canadian families to donate to charity. So those families that do need it have less. That is the constant and unblemished record of failure of this government and their failed policies. That's why Conservatives are fighting this. So instead of voting in favor of a bill that will just add to the cost of government, instead of leaving Canadians with a situation where this government has to go out and borrow more and more, paying higher and higher interest rates. I mentioned at the beginning of my speech how the Bank of Canada is losing money for the first time in Canadian history. This is the perverse outcome of the bond purchase program that the Bank of Canada initiated to help pay for the government deficits. When they bought the bonds, the Bank of Canada bought them at very low rates. The Bank of Canada had lowered its overnight rate as low as 50 basis points. It was down 0.5%. Was the Bank of Canada's rate. So the bonds that the Bank of Canada holds that the government has to pay interest on, the government has to pay interest at 0.5%. Well, remember, the way they bought those bonds was they put large deposits into the bank accounts of those large financial institutions. So, for example, TD Bank or CIBC, they have an account at the Bank of Canada, and there's a deposit in that account for the bond that bank sold to the Bank of Canada. Well, guess what? As interest rates rise, the Bank of Canada has to pay more interest to those large financial institutions than the government pays the bank in interest. That's unbelievable, Madam Speaker. This is a direct transfer of wealth from hard-working taxpayers paying money to the government. Government then turns around and pays the Bank of Canada interest, and the Bank of Canada doesn't have enough. So they're going to lose money. I believe that they've indicated that they expect to lose about $4 billion this year. Well, it's from the bank's website, so if the member for Winnipeg North thinks I shouldn't believe everything I read on the bank's website, he should maybe call his friend Tiff Macklem and ask him to be a little bit more accurate.
This is a speech and not necessarily a conversation. Thank you.
Not as if he should, but duly noted, Madam Speaker. So the question for the government is, are they going to have to bail out the Bank of Canada with taxpayers' money? After taking taxpayers' money to pay interest on the bonds that it sold, they will now have to underwrite the difference that the bank is paying out to other large banks. If you follow the logic here, Madam Speaker, that basically this government's going to have to underwrite the deficits that the Bank of Canada is racking up due to their own deficit spending. This is a triple insult to Canadians when you look at all the interest that's being paid. So I see my time is up, Madam Speaker. I will close by urging my colleagues on all sides of the House to stop digging when you're in a hole. Don't pour water on that grease fire. No more inflationary spending that will make the problem even worse.